All right, thanks, Todd. I love that back and forth singing. So that last one, that was really, really good. Well, it's good to be together tonight. Hope you had a good afternoon. We are going to be in 2 Peter tonight, continuing our study of this letter that addresses false teaching. And we're in chapter 2, where false teaching is directly addressed. So chapter 1, we're really looking at what is true and what is real, because the number one protection against heresy is to be firmly established in the truth. Now in chapter 2, we get to the false teaching, where we're just going to directly look at it. And it is a very strong warning and a scathing condemnation of false teachers. So some of you were here this morning, you're going, well, we had a really heavy sermon this morning. I'm hoping tonight we'll lighten it up a little bit. I didn't plan this too well. We ended up with 2 heavy sermons in a row, but that's how it goes, and I pray that there will be encouragement in it. So let's look at it together. 2 Peter chapter 2, we're going to read verses 1 through 10a. That's where we're going to break tonight. Now, just remember as we start right here, Peter has just talked about the truth of Scripture, divinely inspired Scripture, that what we have relayed to you is true. It's not made up. Then he launches into this. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he had saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Okay. Wow. Challenging. And that's just the start of chapter 2. We've got a couple more weeks of this. No, it is super important, but heavy and difficult. So we're going to look at it under 2 headings: false teachers and God's judgment. I was just noticing after the GOP debate the other day, you get news articles that come out, the fact checkers. Follows any kind of political debate like that, you got the fact checkers. And I went through one of the articles. I was really looking to see what the headings were because of what I'm studying tonight. They had false, largely false, mostly true, misleading, needs context. Okay, there's all kinds of ways that we look at this and say, yeah, that's partially true, not really. Social media, there's all kinds of efforts, massive efforts to stop disinformation and misinformation. Now, I'm not raising those to get into that. I just want to point out that calling out falsehoods, false presentations of things is a thing right now. Okay? All over in our culture, there are people who are saying, you don't misrepresent the truth. Of course, they're not talking about what we're talking about. And what has struck me in looking at just the heaviness of this chapter is that Peter is saying, I'm far more concerned with church teaching. I'm far more concerned that the truth is rightly presented on things that matter eternally. So watch out for that which is misleading, manufactured, or false. Be on alert. Recognize it. So there's a few ways that this text causes us to be on alert. He wants us first to recognize the infiltration of false teachers. We see it in verse 1, but false prophets also arose among the people. Notice the past tense there. He's talking about in those Old Testament scriptures, we have plenty of evidence of false prophets being called out. God instructed Israel to distinguish between true and false prophets. This is not a new thing. There have always been false prophets. Just as there will be false teachers among you. You've got to have the same alertness to recognize where something is presented that is false. Now, you notice the difference in there, the distinction between prophets and teachers. I think part of that distinction is to say not every false teaching presumes to be divine revelation. There can be somebody who's a false teacher that's not claiming to be a prophet. It's the same issue, though, that you've got to pay attention to. We've got to be on alert for the infiltration of false teachers among us, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies. Now, if you just look really literally at the Greek, secretly is not really there. It just means to bring in. We put secret because of the context. It can mean that it's something that's subtle, but also because the parallel passage in Jude 4 talks about certain people have crept in unnoticed. So it does seem to be indicating that there's a subtle, not always obvious way that false teaching gets introduced. So you want to be alert to the infiltration of it that probably doesn't announce itself. It may even downplay the significance or the level at which it diverges from Christian truth. But the main emphasis is that views are brought in from the outside. That's what you're paying attention to. Where are views of the wider culture being brought into and bought into as the views of the church? And they are destructive, these heresies. So heresies just means an opinion or a view. So you're on alert for opinions or views that come from the outside world into the teaching of the church that are destructive. They are, in other words, not of little consequence. They do harm to the truth that we've been entrusted to and to the harm of Christians. Just by way of illustration, I was thinking about when I was a kid chopping cotton on the farm, and you're weeding out weeds from the cotton field, and we had this thing called morning glories. All right, some of you are familiar with morning glories. They just devastate a cotton crop, and I wasn't too concerned with the crop. I was more concerned with the work, and morning glories are just a pain to get out. And my mom wanted to plant morning glories in the yard. How can you do that? Morning glories, they're beautiful. Okay? In one setting, you look at them and say, wow, that is really beautiful. But you bring that into a cotton crop, and it's destructive. There are a lot of things that our world admires that right now are elevated and esteemed that people look at and say, this is right and good and true. And if you bring it into the church, it's destructive. So be on alert for those destructive views that sometimes infiltrate the thinking among us. It says there, even denying the master who bought them. In other words, this is no small thing. Now, not every destructive heresy is going to come across as straightforward as denying the master. But I think if you pay attention, it actually, even when it's subtle, it is denying the lordship of Jesus. When we allow something else, some other view, someone else to now have the authority. In other words, we make Christ subject to a larger narrative. So one author really helped me think about this, Douglas Herring. He says, some within the church have become persuaded that the world beyond the church tells a bigger and better story than the gospel. Does that make sense? That it infiltrates. Some within the church sometimes get it in their mind that what they're hearing in the wider culture and what all of their peers are believing and promoting, well, it makes more sense to me. And we kind of buy into it maybe a little bit more than what's presented in these ancient words. The Christian gospel, so it seems to them, to someone who's buying into that, the Christian gospel, so it seems to them, will need to justify itself in relation to this larger, culturally established story. There's a lot to think about there, and I think it's extremely relevant right now. That if we're not careful, we're so believing what is just established in the wider culture that we start having to feel the need to justify Christian teaching. And when you do that, it actually is denying the lordship of Jesus. It makes it so that culture is actually setting the terms, the conditions, and the limits of our views. You think about how often right now, sometimes we find ourselves perhaps afraid to say what we believe because it so conflicts with the views of the wider world. I think it's natural to feel that. We want to be bold and courageous, not offensive. Nothing about this is meant to make us offensive. But it's to recognize that the power of that narrative is so strong around us that if we're not careful, we will make it louder. We will make it the stronger voice and feel the need to somehow fit Christ and his teaching into that, to make Christ and his teaching subject to the views of the wider culture. That is extremely destructive. That's the infiltration of false teaching that we are to be on alert to. He says here, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. More on that later, okay? That's like a warm-up to what we're getting to. So we pay attention to the infiltration of false teaching. Then we notice the influence. Look at verse 2. And many will, notice many, this is a wide influence, a major influence, and many will follow their sensuality. If you just take various translations and compare the different versions, you'll get the New King James Version, I believe it says destructive ways in place of sensuality. NIV, depraved conduct. New American Standard, indecent behavior. There's various ways to interpret that, but it's pointing out that where you see people that buy into the views of the outside world, it's often expressed in depraved conduct, in immoral living, particularly in terms of sexual permissiveness. And I think that because of verse 10. We read it all the way down at verse 10. You notice he'll kind of underline those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion. One of the evidences of people who are buying into the cultural narrative and making that higher in authority than the word of the gospel is you will see it expressed in sexual permissiveness. And he's saying where that happens, it's destructive because it influences others. And it leads others to abandon the sexual ethic of Scripture and to buy into the sexual ethic of the culture, which, no question, they are at odds. And again, the purpose tonight is not to bash everybody for all of their views. People don't share the faith. They live in all kinds of wild ways. What we want to pay attention to is that we're not bringing that in, that we're not letting the sexual practices, sexual immorality, the sexual ethic define norms in the church. We've got to listen to what Scripture says on that. If you diminish the view of Christ's sovereignty, and in the larger picture of 2 Peter, that's what's happening. They're talking about, where's the second coming? Is he coming back? And Peter's saying, he's coming back. As you start to deny that, you start to deny that the master is going to come back, that the judge is going to have judgment day. If you start denying that, what follows is a justification of the culture's view about sex and other ways of immoral leading. If you diminish the view of his sovereignty, it naturally leads to laxity in our lifestyle. Now, this is the reverse image of chapter 1. In chapter 1, the knowledge of Christ leads to a virtuous life. Knowing Christ leads to a life that imitates and models that excellence. We're seeing just the opposite here, that where the knowledge of Christ is set aside for the knowledge of the culture, it leads to a life of sin. So many will follow their sensuality. They will be led into that. It will have wider influence than just the ones who are practicing it. And because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed or reviled. This might be an echo of Isaiah 52:5. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation, it says, because of you, my name, God's name, is always blasphemed among the nations. So when our practice doesn't follow what he teaches, it reviles the way of truth. We put it this way, when Christians follow their lustful passions, Christianity is viewed as just another path to self-indulgence. If we don't look distinct in our lifestyle, it discredits the message. And it makes it look like we're just one of a number of people who are trying to find some happiness, some satisfaction. The message of culture is, if it works for you, it works for you. If it's true for you, it's true for you. No, this is a distinct truth, that we live no matter the cost. It's not about pleasure, it's about loyalty to Christ. This is why we cringe. I think a lot of us cringe when we see news articles about, the headline will always say, Christian pastor is caught with some explicit material, or Christian pastor caught in some scandal. And we cringe. None of us are perfect, right? Everybody sins, but we know that it does so much damage to the church, to our Christian message, when in the name of Christ we look just like everybody else. He's saying if we follow the practices of the wider culture and we let that infiltrate the church, it really kills our witness and it discredits the way of truth, causes it to be reviled. Third, fraudulence, and it's just killing me that this doesn't start with an I. It's just how it goes. Okay. Look at verse 3. And in their greed, so there's a couple of things highlighted there. You got the lustful passion and indulgence, and here greed, what I want for me, what I get out of this. In their greed, they will exploit you. Now, Peter just uses a business word for a transaction or doing business right there. But in the context, we translated exploit because it very clearly has negative connotations. It's saying they're not helping you, they're fleecing you. Some might appear to be serving you and doing you good, but actually it's their own benefit that they seek in their greed. They're motivated by self-interest, and so they take advantage of you. Watch out for that. Oh, and we've been alert to it for a long time, right? That's why I talked this morning about stereotypical preachers. The title preacher is hurt because of TV preachers, not just them. Okay, we're none of us perfect, but TV preachers, you've heard the sermons where they're going, send in your seed money. You're like, no, don't send in your seed money. They're fleecing you. It's greed. It's not somebody really helping you. But it's not just TV preachers. I mean, we see a lot of people today, ministers, I think, more concerned with building a brand or a platform than they are serving the church, using others for their own benefit. It's just these little signals that say where you see that, you're not seeing the true nature of a Christian teacher. They will exploit you with false words. The word for false there is the word that we get plastic from, which is interesting. In their greed, they will exploit you with plastic words. I love that. Manufactured words, made up, man-made words. Hey, just think about this in the context. Remember from last week, Peter said, we, apostles, we did not follow cleverly devised myths. What we relayed to you was not made-up stories, but there will be among you made-up stories. There will be among you plastic words. There will be man-made teaching that is deceptive and harmful. Be alert to it. That's what he's getting at. Now, he's also made clear that judgment is hanging over the heads of those who are false teachers. So that is our second heading, God's judgment. The following verses, 4 through 10a, it's one long sentence, which gets really complicated. Actually, it has a very straightforward point, even though it can be a little bit confusing. So what I'm going to try to do is just very quickly take us through and try to get the big picture of this without getting too down in the details, although I'm not very good at that, so we'll see. I may completely fail at this. The whole sentence follows an if-then structure. Okay? If this is the case, then we can conclude this. So this long section, that's what's happening. If, then. Now, there are 3 Old Testament stories of God's judgment that he's going to highlight. And I have worked it so that they all begin with J. Okay. First, judgment of angels, verse 4. For if God, notice the if, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. Just pause the sentence for a second. That's one story. It's referring almost certainly to Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Of the 3 examples, this is the most debated as to what story he's talking about. But I think it's pretty clear, Genesis 6, 1 through 4. This is when the sons of God took the daughters of men. Okay, raises lots of questions. There's lots of mystery there, lots that we don't understand. There's a parallel verse to this in Jude 6. It talks about angels leaving their proper dwelling. Both of these are talking about the same thing. What I want to point out is that he's referring to that one particular Old Testament story that is an example of judgment. Now, he says, if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell. In Greek, he uses the word Tartarus, which in the Greek way of thinking is a place lower than Hades. It's a place of punishment. And again, I don't want to get into too much details there, but it's what he's saying. He's presenting that as preliminary punishment, that God is able to keep them until judgment. In chains of gloomy darkness, probably indicating they were confined by God in their sphere of activity. I have to say probably, there's lots of head scratching in there. There's a lot of difficulty in there. Now, something that's real interesting is this verse right here echoes Jewish tradition. It echoes the apocryphal work of 1st Enoch, which is quoted in Jude 14 and 15, but there are beyond that one quotation, there are other allusions to extra-biblical Jewish writing. This is one of those where this presentation of that story seems to be leaning on the backdrop of Jewish writing that is not in our New Testament. Okay, it raises some questions. I think it actually helps us in this. We'll get back to that. The main point, though, is what? God judges the wicked. Okay? If God judges the wicked, He gives you an example, an Old Testament example of God judging even wicked angels. Even the angels don't escape His judgment. Now, second example, judgment of the ancient world. Verse 5. If He did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when He brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Okay, pause the sentence for a second. Genesis 6, 5, and following, the story of the flood. Okay, this wickedness of man was great on the earth, and God destroyed the ungodly with a flood. Okay, we recognize that story. But notice there, preserved Noah and 7 others. That is a new element. Okay, He judges and He rescues. A new element is brought in. Now, again, let me give you just another head scratcher, just interesting. This language of a herald of righteousness probably is an echo of another extra-biblical Jewish writing, 1 Clement. Okay, it's just interesting, just a head scratcher to think about. But the main point is really clear. God judges the wicked, in this case human, the whole world, the ancient world, and God rescues the righteous. So He adds a new element. Okay, here's the main things He's pointing out. God judges the wicked, God rescues the righteous. Some have pointed out there's maybe a sub-point we could take from this when he talks about Noah and the 7 others who are saved. It might be a reminder that the godly are often in the minority, and I think there's some encouragement to take in that as we're thinking about being faithful. The godly are often in the minority. Okay, the third example is the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. 2 Peter 2, 6 through 8. If by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, He condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly. Okay, this is Genesis 19. He's following the order of 3 stories in Genesis. This one is all over the Bible, repeated as an example of judgment in the Bible. To my count, 14 times in the Bible. I've heard some say as many as 20 times. I didn't get into it too much. This is an often repeated example of God's judgment. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah committed very grave sin. It resulted in God raining down burning sulfur and fire. So they are turned to ashes. That language is interesting. To ashes. That actually echoes the language of the Jewish writings of Philo. Okay, but besides, that's just a head scratcher. But the main point, of course, God judges the wicked. And, verse 6, and if He rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Okay, so rescues righteous Lot. Now that characterization of Lot as righteous, now if you've been scratching your head with me, you might start thinking, is that maybe an echo of Jewish literature, extra-biblical Jewish literature? Yeah, it appears to be, the wisdom of Solomon. But, set that head scratcher aside, the main point is really clear. God judges the wicked, God rescues the righteous. Do you see what He's doing? He brings in the 3 Old Testament stories and makes the point, God judges the wicked. God rescues the righteous. That's the takeaway. That's the concluding point. Look at verses 9 and 10. Then, the concluding point, if then Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. So, really clear message. God will not forget those who malign the truth. He judges the wicked. It doesn't go unnoticed by him. He will bring judgment. Neither will he forget those who hold fast to the truth. Do you hear that? That's what we hold on to. That's the comfort in the verse. That's the hope in it. He will not forget those who hold fast to the truth. He knows how to rescue. And often you're in the minority. Hold fast to the truth. You've got so many examples to give you that encouragement. Hang on to that. It encourages faithfulness because the message is true. And that is the point he's made in chapter 1. It's true. Now, I know twice in a row over time, but I feel like I've got to finish with this. Because as I was studying, I found one writer that really helped me think in a balanced way about this. He warned about the heresy hunt. And I think anytime we read something like this, we need to also be warned that we are not heresy hunters in this way. He describes it this way: becoming so ultra-sensitive to every fine nuance of expression that we read people out of the kingdom on the basis of the most subtle theological differences. Okay, I really appreciate that, because an alertness to false teaching is not pointing out every mistake, every flaw, every minute difference that we have with one another. We need to be alert to destructive heresies. We need to hold fast to the essential truths of the gospel. But we also need to be discerning, humble, and gracious with one another. Not quick to quarrel or to pass judgment. Romans 14 is a great example of that. Don't quarrel over opinions or pass judgment on one another. You may come out in different places on different passages. I think it's interesting, helpful, fitting that the very passage that is telling us to hold on to the truth and to watch out for false teaching is a text that itself raises a lot of questions. And that there's all kinds of views. Those examples that we gave and how he's maybe referring to Jewish text, people are all over the place in their interpretations of those things, even though the point is crystal clear. So I think it's fitting that even this text is one of those where we don't all come out in the same place. So be gracious, be humble, but be alert. Don't be deceived. Don't be led into denying the master who bought you with his blood by allowing the outside world to have true say over your life. Okay, again, second time today, I apologize for going long. Appreciate your graciousness. If you've got something weighing on you tonight, something we need to pray about, if you want to be baptized tonight, I know I've gone long, but I am certain that everybody here would be really happy to do that with you tonight, help you with that tonight. So if we can help, come to the front while we stand and sing.